What if the only thing standing between you and the life you are meant to live is the decision you keep refusing to make? What if the dream you buried under fear and excuses and the opinions of other people was actually the right dream? The true dream. The one that was always supposed to be yours. What if the problem is not that you lack talent, or money, or opportunity, but that you are simply not willing to feel uncomfortable long enough to find out what you are truly made of? Sit with that question for a moment, because today, that question is the door we are walking through together. And on the other side of that door is a story that will challenge everything you think you know about risk, identity, and what it really means to build something from nothing. Welcome to English to Inspire, the channel where every story is a lesson in language and in life, where you learn real English while learning what real courage looks like in a human being, and where every word you hear is designed to move you forward, not just teach you grammar, because language without meaning is just noise, and you deserve more than noise. If this is your first time here, take a moment right now and subscribe to this channel, because what we build together here, week after week, story after story, is something rare, something honest, and something that could genuinely change the direction of your life. Make that small decision right now, and let it be the first of many good decisions you make today. His name is Phil Knight, and before he became one of the most powerful businessmen in the history of the world, before Nike became a symbol worn by billions of people on every continent, before the swoosh became more recognizable than the flags of most countries, he was just a quiet, awkward young man from Portland, Oregon, who loved to run and had a feeling deep in his chest that he could not explain and could not ignore. A feeling that something bigger was waiting for him. Something that did not yet have a name. Something that the world around him could not see and would not understand, but that he carried with him every single day, like a secret fire. His father thought he was wasting his time. His friends thought he was chasing a fantasy. The banks laughed at him. The system rejected him. And there were years, long and brutal years, when he did not know if he would survive the next month, the next phone call, the next bill that arrived with no money in the account to pay it. And yet, he kept going, not because he was fearless, but because he had decided, quietly and completely, that stopping was simply not an option he was willing to accept. And that single decision, that refusal to quit, dressed as stubbornness, as madness even, turned out to be the most important business strategy he ever used. Phil Knight's story is not a fairy tale about a lucky man who caught a lucky break at the right time. And you need to understand that clearly from the very beginning. Because if you think this is a story about luck, then you will miss everything that matters. You will walk away feeling inspired for 20 minutes and then go back to your comfortable, shrinking life, and nothing will change. So instead, listen carefully. Listen like your future depends on it, because in many ways, it does. And it all begins in a classroom, with a young man, a blank piece of paper, and an idea so simple it was almost embarrassing. There is a moment in every person's life when an idea arrives, and that moment is not loud or dramatic or cinematic the way movies make it look. It is quiet, almost ordinary, like a whisper in a room full of noise. And the only difference between the people who change the world and the people who watch the world change is whether they chose to listen to that whisper or walk past it on their way to something safer, something more acceptable, something that would not require them to risk everything they had and everything they were. And for Phil Knight, that moment arrived in 1962 inside a classroom at Stanford University, one of the most respected business schools in the entire world. He was 24 years old, sitting in a class called Entrepreneurship, and the assignment was simple on the surface, but enormous underneath, because the professor asked every student to write a paper about a small business they could theoretically start, a business built around a real opportunity in the real world. And most students wrote safe papers about safe ideas. But Phil Knight sat down and wrote about something that had been living inside him for years without a name, something connected to his love of running, his obsession with performance, and a question that had quietly been building in the back of his mind every time he laced up his shoes and hit the track in the early morning darkness. The question was this: Japanese companies had completely transformed the camera industry by producing cameras that were just as good as German cameras but at a fraction of the price. So why could the same thing not happen with athletic shoes? Because at that time, the American market was completely dominated by German brands like Adidas and Puma, and the shoes were expensive. And the quality was good but not perfect. And Phil Knight believed, with the kind of belief that lives in the stomach rather than the brain, that a young American company importing high Japanese running shoes could capture a massive piece of that market and build something genuinely important. He wrote the paper, he got a good grade, and then he did something that almost no one in that classroom did. Something so rare and so powerful that it separates dreamers from builders in a single action. Because he did not file the paper away. He did not let the idea collect dust on a shelf inside his mind. He did not wait for the perfect moment or the right amount of money or someone else's permission or approval. Instead, he took the idea seriously. He treated it like a living thing that deserved a chance to breathe. And he made a decision that would alter the course of his entire life, and eventually the lives of millions of people around the world. He decided to go to Japan, a country he had never visited, whose language he did not speak, whose culture he did not fully understand. With very little money, no business experience, no connections, and no guarantee of anything except a burning feeling in his chest that this idea was real, and that he was the person who was supposed to bring it to life. And if that sounds terrifying to you, if that sounds like the kind of thing only a reckless person or a crazy person would do, then you are beginning to understand exactly what it takes to build something from nothing. Because the gap between where you are and where you want to be is almost always crossed not by intelligence or talent alone, but by a specific kind of unreasonable, uncomfortable, unstoppable action. Picture yourself on a plane for the first time, flying across the Pacific Ocean toward a country where you know almost no one, where the signs on the streets are written in characters you cannot read, where the customs and the business culture are completely different from anything you have ever experienced, and you have a small amount of money in your pocket, a paper you wrote in a classroom, and an idea that has not yet proven itself to anyone, including yourself. And you have to ask yourself, honestly, right now, sitting wherever you are as you listen to these words, whether you would have the courage to board that plane, because Phil Knight did, in the autumn of 1962, and that flight changed everything. When he arrived in Japan, he did not go directly to any shoe company because he spent time first traveling, absorbing the country, feeling its rhythm. And this was not wasted time, even though it might have looked that way from the outside, because Phil Knight understood something instinctively that many people never learn, which is that preparation is not always visible, that sometimes the most important work you do happens inside you, before it ever shows up in the world around you. And he was preparing himself emotionally and mentally for a conversation that required him to be someone slightly larger than he actually was. At that moment in his life, he found his way to Kobe, Japan, and walked into the offices of a company called Onitsuka Tiger, a manufacturer of athletic shoes that were innovative and significantly cheaper than their European competitors. And when the executives asked him which company he represented, Phil Knight did something that took pure nerve, because he did not say he was a young student with no company and no money and no experience. Instead, he looked them in the eyes and told them he represented a company called Blue Ribbon Sports, a company that did not exist, a company he invented on the spot in that room, in that moment, under pressure, because he understood that the idea was real, even if the infrastructure around it had not yet been built. The executives were interested. They showed him their shoes. They talked about the American market, and Phil Knight held those shoes in his hands, and felt something he later described as a kind of electric certainty. A confirmation that everything his gut had been telling him for years was true, that these shoes were special, that American runners would love them, that there was a real business hiding inside this moment, if he had the discipline and the hunger to pull it out, and he ordered samples right there. He negotiated terms. He shook hands across a cultural and linguistic gap with the confidence of a man who had been doing this for decades, when in reality, he had been doing it for exactly 0 minutes before that day. He flew home to Portland with nothing physical in his hands yet, but with something far more valuable. which was proof that the idea could survive contact with the real world. That it was not just a romantic fantasy dreamed up in a warm classroom, but an actual opportunity that actual business people in another country were willing to take seriously. And now the question was no longer whether the idea was good. The question was whether Phil Knight was strong enough and stubborn enough and hungry enough to do what came next, which was the hardest part. The part no one talks about when they tell success stories. The long, slow, grinding daily work of building something real out of nothing but will and time. There is a version of success that looks clean and fast and inevitable when you read about it in a book or watch it in a documentary. And then there is the real version, the version that happens in real time, day after day, in the cold and the dark and the doubt. The version where there is no audience and no applause and no guarantee that any of it is going to work. And Phil Knight lived inside that real version for years. Long, painful, unglamorous years before the world ever knew his name. And if you are somewhere in that place right now, if you are working on something that no one around you believes in, then this part of the story is specifically and personally for you. When the first sample shoes arrived from Onitsuka Tire, Phil Knight did not have a store. He did not have a warehouse. He did not have employees or investors or a marketing budget. What he had was his car, a station wagon, and a folding table. And he began driving to track meets across the Pacific Northwest, setting up that table on the side of the road near the finish line, and selling shoes directly to runners who had never seen anything like them. Shoes that were light and responsive and affordable, and the runners loved them immediately. They bought them with genuine excitement, and Phil Knight stood there in the Oregon wind watching real people hand over real money for something he had believed in when almost no one else did. And that feeling, that specific feeling, was the fuel that kept everything alive. But selling shoes from the trunk of a car is not a business plan. It is a beginning, and beginnings are brutal, because they demand everything from you while giving you almost nothing back. And Phil Knight was still working a day job as an accountant during this entire period because the shoe sales were not enough to live on, which means he was waking up every morning and giving his energy to work. That was not his dream, so that he could survive long enough to keep building. The dream on the edges of his time. In the evenings, and on weekends, and in every spare hour, he could carve out of a life that was already full. And if you have ever tried to build something on the side while carrying the full weight of your regular responsibilities, then you know exactly how exhausting and how lonely that road can be. His first real partner in this journey was his former track coach at the University of Oregon, a man named Bill Bowerman, who was one of the most respected running coaches in America, and who believed deeply that the right shoe could transform an athlete's performance. And together they formed Blue Ribbon Sports, officially, with each man contributing $500 to get the operation started. And Bill Bowerman would go on to become one of the most important creative forces behind what Nike eventually became. A man who literally took apart shoes in his garage and rebuilt them. Who poured rubber into his wife's waffle iron to experiment with sole designs. A man whose obsession with the physics of running matched Phil Knight's obsession with the business of selling. And together, these two obsessions created something neither of them could have created alone. The early years of Blue Ribbon Sports taught Phil Knight lessons that no classroom and no textbook could ever teach. Lessons about cash flow and trust, and the difference between a customer who likes your product and a customer who needs your product. Lessons about what it means to bet your personal financial stability on something uncertain. Lessons about how to keep going when the bank account is nearly empty and the next shipment has not arrived and the people around. You are beginning to wonder quietly whether you have made a terrible mistake. And the answer Phil Knight gave to all of those doubts, every single time, was not a speech or a strategy or a motivational poster on the wall. It was simply this. He showed up again the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that. Every great thing in human history has a name and a symbol. And the moment that name and that symbol are chosen is almost never as grand or as calculated as people imagine it to be. Because the truth is that some of the most important decisions in the story of a company happen under pressure. Happen fast. happened with imperfect information and a deadline breathing down your neck. And the birth of the name Nike and the creation of the swoosh is exactly that kind of story. A story about creativity born from desperation, about beauty emerging from urgency, and about how sometimes the things that last forever are the things that almost did not happen at all. By the late 1960s, Blue Ribbon Sports had been growing steadily, but the relationship with Onitsuka Tiger was becoming complicated and unstable. There were signs that the Japanese company was looking for other American distributors. There were rumors that they wanted to cut Phil Knight out entirely. And Phil Knight began to understand that a business built entirely on someone else's product was a business that could be destroyed by someone else's decision. And that understanding, that cold, clear moment of strategic clarity, pushed him toward the idea that had been quietly forming in the back of his mind for some time, which was that Blue Ribbon Sports needed to stop being a distributor and start being a brand, needed to stop selling other people's dreams and start manufacturing its own. The new company needed a name, and Phil Knight gathered his small team and they threw ideas around with the kind of chaotic creative energy that comes from people who are tired and under pressure and running out of time. And one of his employees, a man named Jeff Johnson, sent a message in the early hours of the morning with a single word that had come to him in a dream. And that word was Nike, the name of the Greek goddess of victory. A word that was short and sharp and fast on the tongue. A word that felt like motion, like acceleration, like the sound a shoe makes when it hits the ground at full speed. And Phil Knight was not immediately in love with it, but the deadline was real and the word was right, and Nike became the name that would one day be known in every corner of the world. The logo came next, and it came from an even more unexpected place. Because Phil Knight went to a graphic design student at Portland State University named Carolyn Davidson and asked her to create a logo for the new brand. And she worked on several concepts and presented them, and Phil Knight looked at the curved stripe she had designed, the shape that suggested movement and speed in the wing of the goddess herself. And he said something that has become one of the most honest things ever said about a logo that would go on to become one of the most recognized symbols in human history. He said he did not love it, but he thought it would grow on him. And he paid her $35 for the work, $35 for the swoosh, which is perhaps the greatest return on a creative investment ever made. What this moment teaches you is not about logos or brand names or graphic design. It is about something much more important and much more applicable to your own life, which is that waiting for perfect will kill your dream faster than any competitor or any obstacle ever could. Because Phil Knight did not have a name he was completely certain about, and he did not have a logo he was completely in love with. But he had a deadline, and he had a direction, and he moved forward anyway. And moving forward imperfectly is always more powerful than standing still perfectly. And somewhere in your life right now there is a decision you are delaying because you are waiting for certainty that will never come. And Phil Knight's story is asking you, directly and without apology, what you are waiting for. There is a particular kind of pain that only entrepreneurs and fighters understand. And it is not the pain of failure exactly. It is the pain of being attacked at the moment you are finally starting to succeed. The pain of watching something you built with your hands and your years and your sacrifices come under threat from forces that are bigger and older and better resourced than you are. And this is the chapter of Phil Knight's story where that pain arrived in full force, where the road stopped being merely difficult and became genuinely dangerous, where the question was no longer whether Nike could grow, but whether Nike could survive. The trouble with Onitsuka Tiger had been building for years beneath the surface, like pressure beneath the earth, and when it finally broke open, it broke open fast and ugly. Because Phil Knight discovered that Onitsuka Tiger had been secretly negotiating with other American distributors behind his back, actively trying to replace Blue Ribbon Sports and cut Phil Knight out of the market he had spent years building from nothing. And when he confronted them, the relationship collapsed completely. And suddenly, the company that had been his entire supply chain, the company whose shoes had been the foundation of everything he built, was not just gone but hostile. And the legal battle that followed was expensive and exhausting and deeply personal in the way that only betrayals can be. But Phil Knight did not collapse. And this is the part of the story you need to burn into your memory. Because when Onitsuka Tiger sued Blue Ribbon Sports, and the legal fight became serious, Phil Knight did something that takes a specific kind of psychological strength that most people simply do not have, which is that he refused to let the attack on his past destroy his future. He kept his eyes forward. He kept building Nike while simultaneously fighting the legal war in the courtroom. He kept hiring people and developing products and pushing into new markets, even while lawyers and depositions, and the very real possibility of losing everything surrounded him on all sides, like walls closing in. The war with the established giants of the athletic shoe world was not only legal, it was commercial and psychological, because Adidas was a global powerhouse with decades of history and relationships and credibility. And Nike was a young upstart company with a $35 logo and a goddess name, and a group of true believers who were running on passion and coffee, and the stubborn refusal to accept that the bigger players had already decided how the story would end. And Phil Knight understood something about competition that the giants had forgotten, which is that a company fighting for its life moves faster and takes more risks and cares more deeply than a company that is simply protecting what it already has. The legal battle with Onitsuka Tiger was eventually settled, and Nike won, and that victory was not just a legal victory. It was a psychological declaration, a line drawn in the ground that said, this company is real. This brand has the right to exist. This man will not be pushed out of the arena he built. And when Phil Knight walked out of that battle, he walked out harder and sharper and more certain than he had ever been before. Because there is something that happens to a person when they survive a genuine threat to everything they love. Something that cannot be taught in any classroom or read in any book. Something that only comes from standing in the fire and refusing to burn. And that something is the foundation upon which everything that Nike became was built. There is a philosophy at the heart of Nike that most people who wear the shoes have never thought about deeply. A philosophy that was there from the very beginning, woven into every decision Phil Knight made about who to sponsor and who to believe in and who to bet the company on. And that philosophy is simply this: athletes are not just customers. They are not just marketing tools. They are the soul of the brand. They are the living proof of everything the brand claims to believe. And if you choose the right athletes, if you find the ones who run not just with their legs but with something deeper and wilder and more desperate, then you do not just sell shoes. You sell a feeling, and feelings last forever in a way that products never can. The athlete who embodied this philosophy more completely than anyone else in the early years of Nike was a runner from Oregon named Steve Preef, a young man with a jaw like a challenge and a running style that looked less like athletics and more like war. A man who ran every race as if he were personally offended by the distance in front of him, who held American records in multiple events, who trained under Bill Bowerman at the University of Oregon, and who became the first athlete Phil Knight ever truly believed in, not just as a spokesman but as a symbol, as a human representation of everything Nike was trying to say to the world about effort and identity and the refusal to be ordinary. Prefontaine wore Nike shoes, and he talked about Nike shoes, and he believed in Nike shoes with the kind of genuine passion that no amount of money can manufacture. And the runners who watched him race began to notice what was on his feet. And the connection between the brand and the idea of authentic, competitive fire began to form in the public imagination, slowly at first, and then faster. And Phil Knight watched this happen and understood something that would define Nike's entire marketing strategy for the next 5 decades, which is that the most powerful advertisement any brand can have is a real human being who genuinely cares. Because authenticity is the only currency that never loses its value no matter how much the market changes around it. Steve Prefontaine died in a car accident in 1975 at the age of 24, and his death hit Phil Knight and the entire Nike family with a grief that was profound and personal and lasting, because Pre, as everyone called him, was not just a sponsored athlete. He was a friend and a believer and a co-creator of the culture Nike was building. And his absence left a hole that could not be filled by any contract or any replacement. And yet his spirit did not leave the brand. It deepened inside it. It became part of the DNA of everything Nike stood for. And every time Nike later chose to stand behind an athlete who was unconventional or controversial or simply too intense for the comfort of the mainstream, they were honoring the memory of the young man from Oregon who taught them what real hunger looked like. The obsession with athletes led Phil Knight to make one of the most consequential decisions in the history of sports marketing, a decision that seemed questionable to many people at the time, when Nike signed a young basketball player from North Carolina named Michael Jordan in 1984 and built an entire signature shoe line around him before he had won a single professional championship, betting not on what he had already achieved but on what they could see burning inside him. Betting on the hunger rather than the trophy, betting on the fire rather than the fame. And that bet, that specific act of seeing potential where others saw only promise, turned a shoe company into a cultural institution and proved once and for all that Phil Knight's greatest skill was never accounting or logistics or even business strategy. It was the ability to look at a human being and recognize greatness before the rest of the world had caught up. There is a price for everything, and the higher you climb, the heavier the price becomes. And this is a truth that the world's most successful people understand in a way that cannot be communicated through advice or warning, but only through living. Only through arriving at the top of something you spent your entire life building and discovering that the view from up there is not what you imagined it would be. That success at the highest level brings with it a specific and surprising kind of loneliness, a weight that presses down not from failure, but from responsibility, not from losing, but from the enormous and unrelenting pressure of winning at scale. And Phil Knight felt that weight fully and completely when Nike went public in 1980. And the company he had built in his bones became something that belonged, in a very real sense, to the world. Going public means selling shares of your company to outside investors. It means that the people who buy those shares now have a stake in every decision you make. It means that the quarterly numbers and the stock price and the opinions of Wall Street analysts begin to occupy space in your mind that used to belong to creativity and instinct and the pure joy of building. And Phil Knight had built Nike entirely on instinct, on gut feeling, on the kind of fast, emotional decision-making that comes from someone who is deeply and personally invested in every single choice. And now, suddenly, those choices had to be explained and justified and presented in language that satisfied not just his own internal compass, but the expectations of shareholders who cared about returns and margins and predictable growth in a way that felt fundamentally foreign to everything that had made Nike great. The company grew at a speed that was almost frightening during the 1980s. Revenues exploded. The Jordan brand transformed basketball culture. Nike became a genuine global phenomenon. And with that growth came complexity, came bureaucracy, came layers of management and legal considerations and public relations challenges and manufacturing controversies and the kind of institutional weight that accumulates around any organization that grows large enough and fast enough. And Phil Knight found himself spending more and more of his time managing the consequences of success rather than chasing the thrill of creation. And there is a particular exhaustion that comes from that shift, an exhaustion that is difficult to explain to anyone who has not experienced it because, from the outside, it looks like exactly what you were supposed to want. There were board conflicts. There were moments when the people around him questioned his decisions and his leadership in ways that felt deeply personal. There were periods when he stepped back from the chief executive role and handed control to others, only to find that the company drifted in directions that felt wrong to him, that lost something essential that he could feel in his chest, even when he could not always articulate it in the boardroom, and he returned to take control again because the truth was that Nike without Phil Knight's specific and irreplaceable vision was like a body without a nervous system. Technically alive, but missing the thing that made it move with purpose and direction and soul. Leadership at the highest level is not a reward. It is a sentence, and Phil Knight served that sentence with the kind of dedication that costs a man things he cannot get back. Time with his family, peace in his private hours. The simple pleasure of existing without the company living inside every waking thought. And if you are building something right now, If you are in the early, hungry, exciting stages of creating something that matters to you, then let this part of Phil Knight's story be a honest and loving warning. Not a reason to stop. Never a reason to stop. But a reminder that the dream you are chasing will ask more of you than you currently imagine. And the question is not whether you are willing to pay the price at the beginning. The question is whether you are willing to keep paying it long after the excitement has faded and the weight has become real. There are chapters in every life that no amount of success can prepare you for. Chapters that arrive without warning and without mercy and without any regard for what you have built or who you have become or how hard you have worked. Chapters that strip everything away and leave you standing in the dark with nothing but the most fundamental question a human being can face, which is whether you have the strength to continue. Whether the person you are at your absolute lowest is still capable of choosing life and meaning and forward motion over the unbearable weight of grief. And Phil Knight, the man who had fought banks and competitors and lawsuits and his own doubts for decades, met that chapter in the year 1994 when his son, Matthew, was killed in a scuba diving accident in El Salvador at the age of 34. Matthew Knight was not a distant figure in Phil Knight's life. He was a real and present son, a young man who had grown up watching his father build something extraordinary, and who carried within him his own identity and his own dreams and his own complicated relationship with the enormous shadow that a father like Phil Knight inevitably casts. And his death arrived the way all truly devastating losses arrive, suddenly and completely, and with a finality that the mind refuses to accept at first, because the mind is not built to process the permanent absence of someone who was just there, who was just alive, who was just part of the fabric of your daily existence, and then simply is not anymore. Phil Knight has spoken about this loss with a rawness and an honesty that is rare for a man of his generation and his stature, admitting that it broke something in him that never fully healed, that there are wounds a man can carry for the rest of his life that do not close no matter how much time passes or how much success surrounds them. And this honesty matters deeply because it tells you something true about the nature of human strength that the motivational industry often gets wrong, which is that being strong does not mean being unbroken. It does not mean that pain does not reach you or that loss does not devastate you. It means that you find a way to carry the devastation and keep moving anyway. Not because the pain goes away, but because stopping would mean that the loss took not one life, but two. He continued to lead Nike through the grief. He continued to make decisions and set direction and show up to the work, even when showing up must have felt like the hardest thing a human being could do. And in 2016, he published a memoir called Shoe Dog, a book that was breathtaking in its honesty. A book that did not read like the polished autobiography of a billionaire, but like the confession of a human being who had loved something so much and paid such an enormous price for that love that he needed the world to understand what it had actually cost. And the book became a global bestseller, not because people wanted to learn business strategy, but because people recognized in Phil Knight's story something true about their own lives, something about sacrifice and obsession, and the complicated relationship between achievement and happiness. The legacy Phil Knight built stands today as one of the most powerful brands in human history, a company with revenues in the tens of billions of dollars, a brand worn by athletes and artists and ordinary people in every country on earth, a swoosh that carries within it the entire weight of one man's crazy idea, one man's refusal to quit, one man's willingness to feel uncomfortable and uncertain and terrified for decades in pursuit of something he believed in with every cell of his body. And yet when you read his own words, when you hear him talk about his life in his own voice, what strikes you most is not the pride of a man surveying his empire, but the quiet and complex reflections of a human being who understands that a life fully lived is not a clean or simple thing, and that the most honest thing you can say about building something great is that it will cost you more than you know and give you more than you imagined, and leave you with questions that success alone can never answer. So now you know the story, and knowing the story means you have a responsibility, because information without action is just entertainment. And you did not come here today merely to be entertained. You came here because something inside you is restless, Something inside you knows that the life you are living right now is smaller than the life you are capable of living, and that restlessness is not a problem to be managed or a discomfort to be numbed. It is the most important signal your soul will ever send you. It is the voice of your unlived life, knocking on the door of your current one. And the only question that matters now is whether you are going to open that door or walk away from it one more time. Phil Knight was not a superhero. He was not born with advantages that you do not have. He was not handed a map or a guarantee or a safety net. He was a quiet young man with a feeling in his chest and a willingness to follow that feeling into uncertainty, into discomfort, into years of struggle that had no promised ending. And the single quality that separated him from the millions of other people who have had great ideas and never acted on them was not intelligence or talent or luck. It was the decision, made quietly and repeatedly and without applause, to keep going when every reasonable voice in the room was telling him to stop. And that decision is available to you right now, today, in whatever situation you are facing, because it does not require money or connections or perfect conditions. It requires only the courage to choose forward over comfortable. Think about what you are doing with your days. Think honestly and without the comfortable lies we all tell ourselves when the truth feels too demanding. Think about whether the way you are spending your hours reflects the size of the dream you carry inside you. Because time is the one resource that Phil Knight could not manufacture and could not borrow and could not negotiate with. The same resource you are spending right now as you listen to these words. And every hour that passes is an hour that made a choice whether you directed it consciously or not. And the accumulation of those hourly choices is the biography of your life. It is the story that will be told about you. And the only person who gets to decide what that story says is you. The world does not need a perfect version of you. It does not need a version of you that has eliminated all fear and resolved all doubt and achieved complete certainty before taking a single step, because that version of you does not exist and will never exist, and waiting for it is just a sophisticated way of choosing to stay still. The world needs the real version of you. The version that is afraid and moves anyway. The version that does not have all the answers and asks the questions out loud anyway. The version that looks at the gap between where they are and where they want to be and decides that the gap is worth crossing even though the crossing will be hard and long and sometimes deeply lonely. Phil Knight sat in a classroom with a blank piece of paper and wrote down a crazy idea. And then he did the one thing that transforms a crazy idea into a legacy. He believed in it more than he believed in his own fear. He trusted the fire in his chest more than the doubt in his head. And he walked forward into the uncertainty with nothing but that trust and that hunger and that refusal to let the life inside him go unlived. And now the swoosh is everywhere. On the shoes of champions and children and ordinary people who will never know his name but who carry his obsession forward every time they move, every time they push, every time they refuse to stop. And the question his entire life is asking you, directly and permanently and without the possibility of escape, is this: what is the crazy idea you are still waiting to believe in? And what are you going to do about it today?